Hi all, welcome back. So you can see I have started again, or I've started fresh. I cleaned my table up a little bit. I got myself ready to work with the plaster. That's going to be the next phase of our project. Now you'll know the plaster because it's the white powder that came in your kit. You had 2 bags of the pink alginate and you had 1 bag of white plaster. My plan here is to mix this plaster with water into a consistency that's something like a melted milkshake or very heavy cream. That's what I'm shooting for. If I mix it too thin and watery, it's actually going to end up problematic. It's going to end up weak. It's going to be a compromised plaster solution. And even though it'll harden, it'll never be terribly durable. If I mix it too thick and pasty, it's not going to take the shape of my mold. So I have to find that sweet spot in the middle. This might require a little bit of experimentation. You might have to try this a couple of different times. Now, for the sake of this one, I'm just going to mix my plaster in this little clear bucket so that it's easier for me to demonstrate. But there's no reason I couldn't also mix this in one of my paper cups. The other thing you're going to want for this is a mask. I'm going to go ahead and use this N95 mask that I keep around my studio for this type of work. Now, you'll want to do your very best to keep the plaster from billowing up while you work with it. You want to be very careful in that regard. You don't want to breathe that dust. That dust can settle in your lungs and harden there. Not something you want to have happen. That's why we want to keep our mask on. So you want to be careful. Make sure you're mixing thoughtfully and slowly. You have your mask on. You can do this in a space like your office or your kitchen. You just want to be careful. You don't want to get plaster all over the place. You want to take your time and move nice and slowly. Now this is a situation where I like to start with the amount of water I want to use first. I decided I was just going to use about half of one of these cups, the same ones I'm making my molds in. And the reason I think that that's sufficient is because the objects I use are all really small. There's not so much volume to those objects. Actually, something that you can do is you can actually, and I'm just going to do this for an experiment, but you can actually fill a container up to a greater level of volume, and you can mark on the side the level, okay, like that. And I don't know if you'll be able to see my mark or not there. And then if I want to know how much, say for example, my finger takes up, I can stick my finger in there and mark the new level, okay? All right. So if I'm being really careful, you can probably see my 2 marks there. All I have to do is pour off the difference between them. And I've already poured off more than that here. Whoops. And that, right there, that's the volume of my finger. So that's a displacement volume, all right? Now, I'm just going to be a little bit more renegade, and I'm just going to do about half this cup, which is more than I need, because it's going to be easier to demonstrate with. So there's my cup of liquid, and what I want to do is don my mask. So I'm going to get a little muffled here, and I'm going to add plaster to the mix. I'm going to add plaster to the mix, and I'm going to add it so that it fills the bottom and starts to build a little hill up in the middle. When that hill gets to the point where it stops kind of just like instantly getting absorbed into the remaining material, into the water, that's when I'm going to go ahead and do my first mix. If I like the consistency of it, in other words, it's like that melted milkshake or heavy cream, then I'm going to assume it's time to pour, okay? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use my little scraper here. I'm just going to clean it off a little bit more with my pants because that's the way I roll. And I'm going to dip out a little bit at a time. And I'm going to add it to my container. Again, what I'm going for is a little island. I'm trying to build up a little island in there. Now, because this is such a small, there we go. So I built up to the point where there's a little island in the middle that didn't immediately dissolve. So now I'm just going to stick my fingers in there and I'm going to mix, and I'm going to make sure as I mix, I'm just doing a good job of breaking up all the little clumps. Everything is broken up. I don't want any little remaining scuzz buckets of plaster in there. I want a good mix. Now, I don't feel, to me, this still looks a little watery. It's getting close to heavy cream, but it still looks a tiny bit watery. So I'm going to add a little bit more plaster, and I'm going to mix that in real good. And now I think I'm starting to get really nice and close to that volume or to that consistency, to that viscosity that I like. It's starting to kind of move a little differently than water does. It's looking viscous. I think I'm just going to go even a tiny bit more. Just a little bit more. Now, I'm concerned that this plaster had some water in it at some point. I'm feeling a few impurities in there. What that means is somebody let water get into the bag, but I'm doing a pretty good job just getting them all broken up. Those little inconsistencies can cause inconsistencies in your cast, and we don't want that. Okay, I'm getting to that thin milkshake consistency. I'm liking the way it looks. Boy, I even feel like I want that just a tiny bit thicker. There we go. Last hurrah. But I don't want to get to paste. I don't want anything so thick that it actually can't pour. And I don't want to spend all day doing this. I want to make sure I'm ready to pour pretty quickly after I start this process. So that's really good. I feel excellent about the consistency of that. It's like a super heavy cream. It's a little hold, it really holds to my hand. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to carefully pour into my mold, and I'm going to tap it as I do. Okay, I'm just going to tap it like that in an effort to get the air bubbles to come to the top. I'm going to agitate it a little. Now I'm going to put that one aside, and I'm going to try to pour this one now. Now this one requires some finesse, because if you'll remember, it had a lot of little cavities and vacancies to run into. It seems like it's taking the plaster really well. And it's going to keep going. Oh, and it looks like I've filled it up. There's a little air bubble coming. Okay, now I can see that it's also moved a little bit into the crack. So it's going to have a couple of little wings. Now I'm going to just go ahead and pour this one. All right. I'm going to tap it. I'm going to roll it around. I want to make sure I'm getting it to go to all edges. This was the bone that you may have seen me kind of uncover. There we go. And then I had one more that was experimental, and I'll go ahead and fill it up too. Tapping it, making sure that I'm getting it to sort of like release all the air bubbles. There we go. Looking really good. Liking the consistency. We're going to let that one sit. And then just for fun, I'm going to take the finger one, and I'm just going to pour the rest of my plaster around like that. Now what that's going to do is once that sets up, it's going to produce like a little stage. So my finger will be coming out of a little stage. Now, what I would like to ask you to do is not wash this. What I would prefer you to do is just put that aside, let it dry. Let it completely dry. Then you can just flex the plastic a little bit. I'm going to take my mask back down. Then you can just flex the plastic a little bit, and all that plaster will break away from the sides. If you get it to break away from the sides like that, it'll clean up the cup without much trouble. I can brush out what remains, and then just do a quick rinse that's not going to clog my sink, okay? Now my hand is another issue. I'm just going to use a little bit of this water because I don't want to take my hand like this and wash it in the sink. That doesn't seem like very much material, but I could potentially clog the sink with that much material, that much plaster still on my fingers. So I'm just gonna kind of rinse off as best I can. It would have been ideal if I'd had a second bucket. To be honest with you, I was kind of planning to use the bucket I have here as my hand bucket, but then I ended up using it for the plaster because I felt like it made such a good demonstration bucket. So now I've got the bulk of that off of there. I can still let this set up with that water in there and it'll actually set in a meaningful way, and I can still break the plaster out without a problem, even though that wasn't my original intention. So I'll just wipe off my hands, seal my plaster back up, everything is cast and poured, and now what I have to do is wait for that plaster to cure. Okay, what's going to happen is it's actually going to get really warm. There's a chemical reaction that's at work here that's going to get really warm, and then it's going to cool again. Once it gets to that cool phase, and I can kind of like tap it and feel that it's actually hardened sufficiently, and I can put my fingernail in it and just make a mark with the tip of my nail, I know I'm probably set up at a point where I could extract the plaster from the mold. Now, the tricky thing with alginate is that it continues to hold moisture. It's a pretty wet mold, so it's going to keep that it's going to keep that plaster a little bit wet regardless. So, you do want to pull it out after about an hour or so. Not a great idea to let the plaster just sit in there for long periods of time, or it'll just continue to draw the moisture in from the plaster. So that's it for the plaster casting part of the demo. As soon as these have set up, we'll sort of pull them out of the molds and see how our experiments went.